These are the kinds of stories that thrive in the world today, and yet we long. There's something in us that longs for the fairy tale. They longs for something pure, for something true. You can still tell fairy tales in the modern world today, and you can do it in ways that are subversive, that don't deconstruct it to the point where it destroys the story. Welcome back once again to The Golden Thread. It is great to be with you here today. And on the channel, we like to talk about stories. And so we spend a lot of time talking about some of the really ancient stories, the ancient myths that still reverberate with us in the world today. But we also like to take some time also to talk about some of the modern examples of storytelling and really kind of get into a little bit of how those stories can connect to some of the ancient themes that run, these sort of common threads that run all the way through from the primordial past up through the present and carry us forward into the future. And so we like to take some time to do that and think about modern storytelling as well. And when we're thinking about some of the great modern storytellers, there's so many, but a lot of them are filmmakers. And we lost a particularly great modern filmmaker last year in 2025, which was Rob Reiner. Rob Reiner was a filmmaker who had a great run of films, particularly in the late 80s and in the early 90s. And among those, there's movies like A Few Good Men and When Harry Met Sally, and as well as his adaptation of Stephen King's story, Stand By Me. Just a lot of great films, but there's probably one that I think is probably the dearest to most people's hearts. That's is going to be remembered most fondly for the longest time, and that is, of course, his adaptation of the story The Princess Bride. The Princess Bride from 1987, and the story of The Princess Bride was adapted from a novel of the same name. And what's really cool about Rob Reiner's version of The Princess Bride is that the writer of the novel, William Goldman, actually did the adaptation for the screenplay, and so we get to see those two working together. And The Princess Bride is just a classic of modern filmmaking. It's a really, truly classic film, and it's kind of part comedy, and then it's sort of part adventure story, and it's quirky and it's fun, and it's like one of those films that I think of as being almost like it's like one of those quintessential comfort movies, right? It's like that one of those that you can imagine just curling up on the couch and watching. Maybe when you're sick, you got a bowl of chicken noodle soup and you put on The Princess Bride. That's one of those movies for me. And I think in some ways it's actually the way in which the story is told in the film is perfectly representative of that, because in the film, the story is told by a grandfather being played wonderfully by Peter Falk. He's being told to his grandson who is homesick from school. And of course, his grandson just wants to play video games. And but Grandpa says, nope, we're going to read a story here together. And so he reads him The Princess Bride. And so it's a wonderful film. It's a wonderful story, and it's actually, when we think about it in terms of modern filmmaking, it's actually and modern storytelling, it's a very unique movie. It's a very unique story, and one of the things that I think makes it so unique is the kind of story that it is. That there are certain at any point in time, I think that there are certain stories that thrive in certain moments in culture. And if we think about where our culture is at broadly here in the West, we've talked about this recently when we've talked about the idea that our culture is in a lot of ways there's a sort of manyness to our culture that has been brought about in some ways by the advent of postmodernism and the digital age. And there's sort of we're living in a time where there's sort of many voices and many stories and many perspectives, and the kinds of stories that tend to thrive in this sort of postmodernist milieu that we live in today tend to be, I think, the kinds of stories that concern themselves with shades of gray, right? They tend to concern themselves with ambiguity, shades of gray, many times lots of different characters with lots of different perspectives, oftentimes conflicting perspectives. And a lot of times these stories tend to be very devoted to realism, and sometimes even a gritty kind of realism that's been very in vogue, I would say since the 1970s. And we've seen a lot of films come along like this. And these sorts of films and these sorts of stories are very resistant many times to wanting to draw conclusions or to bring the story to what you might call a satisfying ending, where everything, all the threads are tied up and it's nice and neat and you have a little bow and you ship it off. These kinds of stories, I think, oftentimes leave the endings. They tend to be more open-ended by nature. And those are the stories that we see thriving in the world today, which makes perfect sense. But there are certain other kinds of stories that don't thrive as well in this sort of modern paradigm or postmodern paradigm. And one of those is the kind of story that is represented by The Princess Bride, and that is a fairy tale. That fairy tales are a certain kind of story that have been with us for a long, long time. Fairy tales and folk tales, and there's kind of various manifestations of these sorts of stories, but these kinds of stories, in a lot of ways, are very closely related to myths. That myths, the great dramas, as we've talked about here a bit before, these kinds of stories that go way back into the past, these are kind of the grand narratives in a lot of ways. And in some ways, the fairy tale, the folk tale, these kinds of stories are almost like the little cousin of the great myths. They share certain similarities. They share a certain strangeness. There's a strangeness, and oftentimes there's supernatural elements in these kinds of stories, and a devotion to the great heroic journey and the descent and the return and all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of similarities between myths and fairy tales, but fairy tales in a lot of ways, in some ways, they do also deviate from the myths in the sense that they tend to be smaller stories. They tend to be more plentiful, and they tend to have there's many different versions oftentimes of these stories. They tend to lend themselves very freely to adaptation and changing form. There's, again, as we said, there's lots of different ways of kind of telling these stories. They tend to be, as we said, more playful, almost kind of a little bit mischievous. They tend to poke fun and are more willing to kind of twist things and turn things around and flip them on their heads and so forth. And if we see, and they've been told and retold many, many, many times, and we see these stories being told. For example, you think about, for example, the sort of the Shakespeare's version of the fairy tale being A Midsummer Night's Dream, and there is that playfulness, that puckishness about it in that story. And then we see, the Grimm's fairy tales, where the Brothers Grimm were able to take and compile anthologies of these kinds of stories and adapt them and retell those stories. And then we see even in the 20th century, with the advent of filmmaking, we see the Walt Disney versions of some of the classic fairy stories like Snow White and Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty and others. And so they've been told time and time again. And every time that stories get retold, it's as if they begin to, it's like they're seeds that get planted in the soil of the time and the place that they are growing in. And they take on certain characteristics of that time and that place. There's a certain ethos about them. And so we see as time has progressed, we've seen many different versions of these sorts of stories, and we see some certain things that remain the same and certain things that begin to change. And there's certain aspects of fairy tales that, as we said, lend themselves to this. But then at the same time, even though there's a playfulness to fairy tales and there's a willingness to kind of twist and change and turn, this sort of like that Brer Rabbit kind of folk tale, the briar patch, where there's an aspect of the trickster. There's a little bit of the spirit of the trickster to the fairy tale that allows it to be able to adapt to different changing times. But at the same time, there is something in the fairy tale that is essential to it. The various kinds of stories, whatever that particular genre might be, they have certain aspects to them that are essential qualities that need to remain consistent in order for that story to remain that kind of story, if you will. So a fairy tale, there are certain things that characterize fairy tales that are core and are essential that make them fairy tales. And there are certain aspects of fairy stories, these certain essential elements that do not well adapt themselves to this kind of postmodernist, ambiguous, shades of gray sort of world that we inhabit today. And that is, I would describe it as that fairy tales tend to be very simple in some ways and very pure, particularly in the way that fairy tales end. Fairy stories many times have to do with going on a certain kind of adventure where there is an aspect of getting lost in the woods, right? Many fairy stories we can think of where the characters get lost in the woods, and there's this aspect of ambiguity and uncertainty and paths coinciding and interconnecting and things being overgrown and not being sure where things are and things not being what you expect them to be. You see a little cottage in the woods and it's got candy for building materials, and you go inside and there's a witch, right? And then, or maybe you go to grandma's house and there's grandma in the bed, but you get a little bit closer and you kind of pull back the covers and it's like, grandma, what big teeth you have, right? And it's not grandma, it's a wolf. And there's aspects of fairy stories that allow for this kind of strangeness and transformation and weirdness, but at the end of these stories, there is a unity that is arrived at. And this unity that gets arrived at in these stories is oftentimes surprising. It's oftentimes startling. It's actually at many times even funny and kind of ridiculous because of how extreme these endings tend to be with the fairy tales. They tend to swing to this extreme, almost hyperbolic place where, for example, on the negative side, you might have, for example, there's an evil stepmother who's been persecuting the characters, and in the end of the story, that character comes to justice. And the justice is usually like so over the top. Some of the Grimm's fairy tales, it's been talked about how like these are children's stories in a lot of ways, quote unquote, but they tend to be, some of the endings of these stories are horrifically violent, where it's like, the evil stepmother like gets hacked to pieces, like not just merely, killed for, what she's done, but instead she gets like dismembered, people get their arms and legs cut off, all kinds of, it's just, sometimes these endings of these stories is like just a bloodbath. And it's this extreme devotion to justice. Or on the other hand, you can get these endings of fairy stories that oftentimes will be these larger than life positive endings where you have happily ever after, right? You have the riding off into the sunset, and you have the prince comes and he kisses the princess, and that's it. Like that's just the end. They go off together, or they go to the castle, or the land is saved, or the hero becomes king or returns home, or whatever it is, and it's just everything ends in that way. And there's something about that is very much adverse to the world that we're living in today. There's something about the world that we're living in today. We've talked about this, where we're living in a time where manyness is the defining characteristic of the world and the way in which we tell stories. There's many ways to see things. There's many different narratives. There's a great deal of resistance to there being a single defining narrative or a single conclusion or tightening things up, or there being this sort of this happily ever after, or this final justice, or good triumphing over evil, or love conquering all, things like that. That is seen today in this era where we see our culture being pervaded by this kind of postmodernism, this kind of almost radical skepticism about things, oftentimes even critical theory, breathe, these kinds of things. There's a suspicion of any kind of narrative that wants to just wrap itself up so cleanly and so neatly, and yet that's what fairy tales do. And I would say this, that I think that is actually a defining characteristic of what a fairy tale does, and that is what a fairy tale is. And that if a story isn't willing to go there, you can still tell a great story, but it's not really a fairy tale. It's like, if you don't have it come together in that way, if you want to tell some other, ambiguous story, you can do that, but it's not a fairy tale. And so I think that modern storytellers really struggle with this area of how do we tell a fairy story? How do we tell a fairy tale in the sort of modern world? And we can see examples of people struggling, people trying to tell this kind of story in the modern era, particularly with films, and sometimes being successful and many times less so. And what I want to talk about for a few minutes here today is I want to give you just a few examples to chew on here of some modern examples of fairy tale style storytelling that might be less successful. And we can think about what it is about them that where they might go astray or where they might struggle and not be able to really pull it together in that way. And then maybe some examples of really positive ones. And I'll just go ahead and say this, that I think that The Princess Bride is an example of a great modern, or even you could say even postmodern fairy tale. Like, it's a great example of that. We'll talk about what it is about the story that makes it so successful. But first, I want to talk about maybe some examples of attempts to tell stories in this kind of postmodernist way that are not as successful in the realm of fairy tale. And so one such example that I would want to think of here is that over the past couple of years, we've had some film adaptations of the stage play Wicked, which was based in turn on The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which was the 1939 film. And then that film, in turn, was based on the stories that were told by a writer in the early 20th century, L. Frank Baum. And there's a whole bunch of these kinds of Wizard of Oz stories. But Wicked has been kind of the most recent version, the most recent adaptation of that story. And really what it is in a lot of ways is it's a revisionist version of The Wizard of Oz. It's kind of you could say it's sort of a revisionist or a subversive fairy tale. And there's actually been a lot of these kinds of revisionist or subversive fairy tales that we've seen over the past several decades or even longer further back. You can think about examples. We'll talk a little bit about, there was a stage play called Into the Woods that got a film adaptation in 2014. There's others as well, even in slightly different genres that are kind of similar, but not exactly fairy tale. Like you have the kind of like gothic horror / fantasy world where you see we've seen the Twilight novels and the Twilight films, which were essentially taking that kind of world of werewolves and vampires and subverting it and kind of turning it on its head. And now, werewolves and vampires are sparkly now, right? They're sparkly and they're attractive and they're, Robert Pattinson. And so there's this kind of this desire to kind of take that sort of story and twist it and pull it and turn it into something that's just a little different. Or you think about the Harry Potter stories and the novels and the wild success with those by J.K. Rowling, and the films as well. Wonderful stories, wonderful films, not exactly fairy tales, kind of more in the sort of young adult fantasy kind of realm, but there's a little bit of the quirkiness and the fairy tale sort of aspect to those stories. And again, they kind of take things, they sort of twist them and turn them a little bit. They kind of allow for witches and wizards to be sort of coexisting with one another at the same school, out of which, sort of good wizards and good witches come, and also the evil ones as well. And so the Dark Lord is also a graduate of the same school that Harry Potter goes to. And so there's a little bit of twisting and turning and subversion that goes on there. And so this has been, I think, an attempt by many writers and storytellers to sort of take some of these classic themes and some of these classic styles of storytelling and update them for a modern audience that is not happy with or is not satisfied with this very pure, simple, kind of good versus evil, black and white sort of style of storytelling, but to tell it in a way that admits for more shades of gray and more ambiguity in some of these stories. And as we said, some of these has been very, very successful, and some of them a little bit less so. And when we're thinking about, let's say, like an example of, let's talk about, for example, Into the Woods, right? So there's the story Into the Woods, which was, again, a stage play and then was adapted into a film. There's certain things that this adaptation gets right about fairy tales, which is it gets right. The main thing I would say that it gets right is the title itself, Into the Woods, and the theme of what does it mean to go into the woods. And this is a major component of fairy tales, which is the aspect of the story going and the characters going into a place where they get lost, right? There is a losing oneself, a going down the rabbit hole, as it were, and things being unexpected as you go down there, right? You open the door and you step into the room and it's larger than it was on the outside, or you take the bottle and you drink it and all of a sudden you shrink way down to the size of a teacup, right? And we think about Lewis Carroll and those stories, the Alice in Wonderland stories, which, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien, in his famous essay on fairy stories, he differentiates between those kinds of like dream stories and what he would refer to as being like the more like dyed in the wool, like true form fairy stories, but we won't bother ourselves to parse out all those niceties. Suffice it to say that these are all stories that kind of exist in the same sort of family of stories, right? So there's a characteristic of going into the woods, down the rabbit hole, off to Neverland, whatever it might be, and finding yourself lost. And there's sort of a weirdness and a twistedness, and there's an uncertainty. Like that's ambiguity, right? Like that's the shades of gray. And there's an encounter with ambiguity and an encounter with strangeness and uncertainty that is essential to the fairy story. But where I think the story of Into the Woods goes astray, and where a lot of the modern attempts to retell these kinds of stories go astray, is that Into the Woods doesn't allow for us to leave the woods. The point of the story essentially is that the woods themselves are the world in which we live. That we go into the woods, but there isn't really a way of leaving. That essentially the woods themselves, this forest, this ambiguity, these conflicting paths and uncertainty and all of this kind of thing that we find ourselves lost in, that's actually the world. And that the moral of the story in the story of Into the Woods essentially is that we need to learn to live in the woods. Like we need to learn to live in this world of ambiguity and uncertainty and shades of gray. And that's just the way it is. Like that's what we have to do. And what I want to say about this is that moral is valuable. Like that is actually a very valuable moral. That's a very valuable thing to say, and it's a very, very valuable thing to teach. And there are certain kinds of stories that teach that, right? That when we look at the world, it's not black and white, right? Like it is shades of gray. It is weird. Like postmodernism doesn't get it wrong. Like it actually gets it right when we look at the world, and there are different narratives and there are conflicting viewpoints, and we do need to learn how to coexist and exist in the world with all of this, this space for difference and this space for uncertainty and ambiguity. Like we need that. We need the kinds of stories that teach that to us. But where I think that the modern storytelling effort goes astray is that we've failed to identify the purpose of certain kinds of stories. And fairy tales have a purpose, and that's not it. Like that is not the purpose of fairy stories. That could be those kinds of stories can be told in a lot of other ways, but it's not the fairy tale through which they're to be told. You could take the trappings of a fairy tale and take them and insert them into a different kind of story, and that would be fine. But if you're telling a fairy tale, there needs to be a different point that's being made, because there's a different purpose that is, I think, essential to what a fairy tale is. And it is not to teach us just that everything is shades of gray, because you remember, in the fairy story, in the end, we come out of the woods. We don't learn to live in the woods and exist in the margin and in the shades of gray. Rather, we learn to go into the woods, to learn our lessons, to get lost, to experience, all the horror and all of the wonder and all of the various things. We go to to fairyland and we experience all these things, but then we come back, and that there is a way of leaving the woods and coming back, and that there is a way of finding that sort of, that conclusion that brings us to the point where we want to be. And that's essential to the fairy tale. But modern stories or postmodern stories are very resistant to actually being willing to do that. And so we see in the story of Into the Woods, there's an unwillingness to go there. We also see a convolution of the archetypes, right? Fairy tales have a tendency to present us with certain very strong images. There are certain very strong images that repeat themselves all throughout fairy tales. And they're archetypal images. They're images that tend to fall into black and white categories, right? Not always, but oftentimes they fall into these kinds of black and white categories where on the one hand, we see evil. And evil is very over the top. It's very clear. It's very clearly defined. It's very clearly characterized. And these sorts of images are images like witches, right? So there's the image of the witch, or the image of the giant, or the image of the dragon, or the ogre, all of these kinds of things. And they're the sorcerer, those sorts of images are very, very strong and very, very clear. But on the other hand, you have the images of the light, and we have images like that of the princess and of the prince and the knight and the king and the shining armor and the kindly old wizard and all of these sorts of images over here. And they're very, very different, and they're very, very distinct from one another, and they're kept very distinct. And you can play with those images, right? Like, once again, we keep in mind that the fairy tale is capable. It's a playful thing. It's a playful place that you can go and you can play around and you can twist things and you can turn things a little bit, and things sometimes aren't exactly what they seem. But at the end of the day, the fairy tale resists any attempt at total inversion, right? Like any attempt at just taking those archetypes and flipping them on their head. But that's exactly what the modern or postmodern storytelling wants to do. It wants to take those things that we thought were clearly good or clearly evil and flip them around and make them into something else. And it doesn't work. It does not work in the context of the fairy tale. And we know that it doesn't work because a lot of times when we watch or read or experience these stories, there's something in us that just doesn't sit right about the endings a lot of times of these stories. And Into the Woods is a perfect example of this, because at the end of the story, what happens is essentially there's a little miniature, you could say, musical lecture that is delivered to us as the viewer or as the listener about what the moral of the story is. That it's pretty pedantic, to be honest. It's very, very clear, and it's being delivered to us by, of all characters, the witch, which in the film is wonderfully played by Meryl Streep. And so the witch is going to teach us about what the point of the story is. And so what does she say? She sings this song, and in the song she says, witches can be right, giants can be good. You decide what's right. You decide what's good. And like that statement is the postmodernist manifesto, right? Like that is essentially the manifesto of a subjective understanding of values, right? That you decide, you determine what is valuable to you, what you think is good, what isn't. And we all, since we live in the woods, right? Nobody gets to have the sort of defining narrative. We all have to decide this for ourselves. And what's also kind of in there too is the fact that the witch is saying this, right? Witches can be right, giants can be good. And we've got to remember, again, in the fairy tale, that's not the case. Like in the fairy tale, these are archetypal images, meaning that they are what they are, right? Like in a very, very deep way. There's things you can tweak and there's things that you can twist, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the Wizard of Oz here. But there's certain things that you don't tweak, and there's certain things that you don't twist past a certain point. And to flip the script and to have the witch become the one who is now instructing us on this kind of subjectivist view of values, it's the antithesis of what fairy tales do. Like it is the absolute opposite of what a fairy story is meant to do. And so in that sense, I believe that a story like Into the Woods fails on that level. It's successful in the first half, but at the end of the story, again, it's that struggle of not being able to go there. I think that the same can be said for Wicked, right? The story of Wicked is, in a lot of ways, it's a fun story. It's an interesting story. It's very colorful. The film adaptation and the stage play, beautiful. The choreography, the music, the acting, the singing, it's a lot of fun, and it's very creative in a lot of ways, and it does some things well and it does some things right. But then there are certain things about it that, again, I think that cut so hard against what the fairy tale is trying to do that it undermines itself. It essentially saws off the branch that it's trying to sit on. And essentially what it comes down to is the question of goodness and wickedness, right? So we have in the original story of The Wizard of Oz, which we'll talk about, we have the idea of good witches and bad witches. We have the good witch, Glinda, and we have the wicked witch of the West. And there's also, in the book, there's also the wicked witch of the East and the wicked witch also, or the good witch also of the South. And so there is that, but in the film, or in the story of Wicked, essentially what the story does is it plays with those ideas, and it offers to us the proposal that wickedness ultimately is defined by something that is not what we would expect it to be. So that essentially that which is wicked is that which sets itself up against, in defiance of, the prevailing cultural narrative. In other words, someone is labeled as wicked who is not willing to bow down to the powers that be, right? Whether those powers are corrupt or whether they're virtuous. If you are wicked, if you're not willing to bend the knee, right? And in the story, Elphaba, who becomes the Wicked Witch of the West, is unwilling to yield to the powers that be, in this case, the Wizard of Oz. She is defiant of the wizard. Glinda, on the other hand, is portrayed as being the good witch because she defers. She is very naive. She is very friendly. She is very, you could say, she's very winsome. She has this sort of agreeable personality type in the Jungian sense, right? So she's agreeable. She's naive, and she's willing to bend, and she's willing to go along with the system and play the game, and also she's cowardly to some extent as well, that she is weak and she's just willing to allow herself to be manipulated. So she is good. And so to be a good little girl or to be a wicked little girl is whether or not you do what you're told. And essentially, and as we can clearly see, that this has a lot in common with the sort of critical theory view of the world, which is that the powers that be define the narrative, and so you either bend the knee or you are labeled as wicked and you are cast out and you are ultimately destroyed. Now, that is a very, very different story from what the original story of The Wizard of Oz actually is. And what's interesting about this is that the story of The Wizard of Oz in itself is a subversive story. Like, The Wizard of Oz takes the fairy tale trope and twists it in all kinds of weird ways. Like, it just takes the kind of the things that we're expecting and flips them on their head and plays all kinds of games with it. And you think about, in this story, if you're familiar with the story of The Wizard of Oz, it is a story not about a princess, but about a little girl, a little farm girl from Kansas, which in itself is a joke, right? Because Kansas is known to be a very flat part of the world, and so it's this flat kind of place where there aren't highs and lows and mountains and valleys, which is what you usually think of when you think of a story, right? And going on an adventure. Instead, it's flat, and L. Frank Baum describes it actually in the book as being black and white. Like, the world is black and white, and this, of course, is just perfectly setting itself up to be rendered into film, where in the 1939 version of the film, they portray Kansas as being black and white and sepia tone. And then when the house flies off in the cyclone and comes to the land of Oz, Dorothy opens the door and all of a sudden it's color and it's beautiful and it's technicolor and it's candy, and it's flowers and it's all these beautiful kinds of things, right? And that's But anyway, it's a story that kind of plays around with those themes. And as the story progresses itself too, we see, once again, subversion and inversion, the fact that there's a good witch and a bad witch, where typically witches are just bad. But he plays with it, and he kind of gives us good witches and bad witches. And then we come to the wonderful Wizard of Oz, where it turns out that the wonderful Wizard of Oz is not actually so wonderful at all. In fact, he's actually a snake oil salesman, right, from the American, Midwest, who just happened to float off there in a hot and land in Oz in a hot air balloon, and he's just been just hoodwinking everybody ever since, right? He's a charlatan. He's playing the part of the wizard, and doesn't actually have any magical powers himself. And so that is a twisting of the story. It's a subversion, right? And in the book, it's actually interesting. He actually even goes a little bit further, and he pushes it like almost to the limit, where when you get to the Emerald City of Oz, the Emerald City in the book is actually not made of emerald. What happens is that you go into the city, and the doorkeeper gives you a pair of green glasses that then are fastened to your head so that you can't remove them, so that the city itself is not made of emerald. It's just where everybody wears green glasses. And that itself, if you think about it, it's like that is essentially a very postmodernist idea. So the Wizard of Oz is in a lot of ways a divisive and a subversive fairy tale, right? And it plays with all these things. But here's the thing, is that the reason why the Wizard of Oz works, and it does work, is because it pushes things as far as you can go, and it twists them in all kinds of interesting and creative ways and creative patterns. But at the end of the day, it refuses to take that final step of inversion. It refuses to bring things crashing down at the end, or to shatter things into fragments, or to remain in the woods, if you will, or to get lost and stay there. In fact, at the end of the story, Dorothy goes home, right? And she learns there's no place like home, and the Wicked Witch is destroyed. She gets melted into a puddle, right? And the wizard, even though he is in some ways a subversive character, the wizard is ultimately benevolent. The wizard is he's not a malicious or malevolent character. He's more of a trickster, right? He takes on that role instead. And all of these are things that you can do in a fairy tale and have it still remain a fairy tale. But what Wicked does is it takes it that next step. It takes a story that's already been twisted to the breaking point, and then it just breaks it, right? It just goes that next step. And in the story, a little spoiler alert, so if you haven't seen the story, well, you're not missing out on too much anyway. But what happens in the story is we discover that the wizard is actually, in the play and in the film, the wizard is actually a villain. Like, he's not just a charlatan, he's actually a manipulative, totalitarian ruler who is trying to twist and who is trying to control, and he's using this army of winged monkeys to maintain control over the world, and propaganda, and all of these kinds of ways of shaping the narrative. And so the wizard becomes a villain. And furthermore, the characters, the Wicked Witch of the West, right, Elphaba in the story, is not actually a villain at all. She actually becomes essentially a martyr, where she has to sacrifice herself at the end. And so when she gets melted, when she's killed, it's her act of sacrifice, essentially, for Glinda, who is her friend. And that relationship is at the center of the story. And so again, there's things that are powerful in this story, but it pushes it to the point where it's like, well, this is not the same story anymore, right? And if you tried to take Wicked and bring it alongside the original story of the 1939 film or the L. Frank Baum story, what you would see is that if you layer the Wicked story on top of that, it breaks it. Right? It breaks it, it destroys it, it actually shatters it into all these pieces, to where you're like, well, so actually the wizard's a bad guy and Dorothy is like his pawn. And so the whole story takes on a different hue. It's like putting on those spectacles, right? The green colored spectacles, except in this case, it's the gray, right? It's like now everything is gray. Nothing is black and white. Nothing is clear anymore. And so we see that happen in the story. And yet at the same time, in the story of Wicked, there's a desire there to actually tell a real fairy tale. It's like when you're in the world of the fairy tale imposes itself on you. It wants you to do certain things. And the story is sort of resisting. And in the end, there's this really great moment where Elphaba says to Glinda, the Wicked Witch and the Good Witch, she says to her, paraphrasing here, but she says essentially, goodness needs to be more than just a word. Like good needs to be more than just a word. Goodness needs to be an action. There needs to be things that we can actually do to better the world that we're in. And that's what goodness is. And it wants to go there, right? And there's this moment where you're like, yes, like that's what it is. Like it's not just all propaganda and shades of gray. Like there is actually good and there is actually evil. Because that's what we want from the story. But the thing is, of course, is that in the song that they sing together, Glinda and Elphaba sing together, in the end, they sing this song where they kind of put this into words. And just to read some of it for you, it says this: I've heard it said that some people come into our lives for a reason, bringing something we must learn. And we are led to those who help us most to grow if we let them, and we help them in return. Well, I don't know if I believe that's true, but I know I'm who I am today because I knew you, like a comet pulled from orbit as it passes the sun, like a stream that meets a boulder halfway through the wood. Who can say if I've been changed for the better? But because I knew you, I have been changed for good. And so what we see there is this desire to be like, yeah, I want to believe that we can change each other for the better, but I don't know if it's true. I can't really say for certain if that's true. And so what it does at the end is it turns it into a joke. It plays with the words, right? It does a little word play of, oh yeah, you have met me and you've influenced me in a way, but I'm not willing to say that you've changed me for the better, but you have changed me for good. And of course, the joke is that in this way of phrasing it, we're saying that I've been changed not for better, but rather I've been changed permanently, right? Another way of using the phrase for good. And it's wordplay and it's subversion and it's a joke. And it's this, again, it's representative of this current day desire to be able to affirm goodness and evil. But we can't do it. We have to make a joke, right? We have to twist it. We have to turn it. We have to make it seem to say something other than what it's saying. And so these would be some examples of modern sort of revisionist fairy tales that they just don't get it right. Like they're trying to, but they just can't quite get there because they've been so influenced by the cultural milieu in which they've grown up. And so, but I think that there is a great example of this in The Princess Bride. So The Princess Bride, I think, is an example of how it actually can be done, that you can still tell fairy tales in the modern world today, and you can do it in ways that are subversive, that do allow for some of these shades of gray, right? But that don't deconstruct it to the point where it destroys the story, right? So like you think about the story of The Princess Bride, for example, there's all kinds of ways in which the story of The Princess Bride is subversive. It plays with things. It twists things. You think about, for example, there's some interplay between the Spaniard Inigo Montoya and the Italian Vicini, where Vicini keeps using this word inconceivable. He keeps saying it over and over, inconceivable. And then the Spaniard at one point turns to him and he says, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." And what's going on there is they're playing around with the idea that words can have meanings that we don't necessarily think that they do. And Vicini is this manipulative character who uses his words to get people to do what he wants them to do. And here, Montoya kind of is like, you know what? Like, I see through your baloney, right? I can see through that there's something that it doesn't actually mean what you think that it means. There's other things that are going on here. And we see it over and over again in the story. There's subversion when it comes to Miracle Max, right? Miracle Max, who is like supposed to be the wizard that saves the day, except he's kind of this snake oil salesman sort of character. It's like, can he actually do miracles? We don't know. He's married to a witch. You're like, oh no, she's not a witch. She's his wife. It turns things around like that. And so they bring the character of Wesley who is dead, right? And Miracle Max is supposed to bring him to life, but it plays with that because it turns out he's not actually dead. He's just mostly dead. And there's a big difference between being mostly dead and all dead, right? And so but see, here's the thing. if they went all the way with it in The Princess Bride, to go all the way with that sort of postmodernist, deconstructionist, ambiguous sort of thing, what would happen was that that he would not, there would be no miracle, right? Like he would just be, oh, it turns out he's not actually dead. Or maybe he is dead and he doesn't come back to life and we do something else, or whatever. There would be something like that where no miracle would happen. But it doesn't do that. And what happens in The Princess Bride is that over and over again, we get subversion, and it gets us to the point where it's like almost going to break it. It's almost going to shatter it. But then instead it turns around and it does the double twist, and it turns around and it gives us the thing that the fairy tales give us, right? That they want to give us. It gives us the miracle, right? So Miracle Max opens his mouth and he pushes on his chest and gets him to exhale his last breath. And he says, well, if his last breath, it means that if he actually died for something noble, then we can do the miracle. But if not, then you're toast. And he exhales his last breath and he says, it's true love. And Max doesn't want to believe it, doesn't want to hear it, but he's like, no, that's what he said, true love. And he says, okay, well, that is worthy of the miracle. And there is the miracle. And he comes back. And then we see, again, we see the character of the Spaniard, of Inigo Montoya, who is seeking justice. He's seeking vengeance for his father who was murdered. He's hunting the six-fingered man. And there's this moment where it subverts you. He's chasing the six-fingered man, and the six-fingered man turns around and throws a knife, and he hits Montoya in the chest, and he falls. And there's this moment where you watch the life drain out of his face, and the villain comes and stares at him and looks down into his face, and he says, you've spent your whole life chasing me, haven't you? Just to die here and not be able to avenge your father. And then he just smiles at him, and he says, I think that's the worst thing I've ever heard. And that is like the triumph, right? That is the triumph of the subversion, right? And if it was truly going to go there, if it was truly going to be a subversive story, that's where it would end. And in some ways, there is a version of the story where that's it, right? Like that's the end. He dies there. And sometimes that happens. Like sometimes that is the way the world works. But that's not the point that the fairy tale wants to make. Instead, we see the Spaniard get back up on his feet, stand up. It's ridiculous, right? He staggers across the room. He draws his sword. He gets stronger and stronger and stronger as he goes, even though he's bleeding everywhere. And then he stabs his nemesis, and he whispers the words of vengeance in his ear, right? And so we see again the refusal to totally subvert. And of course, in the end, they ride off into the sunset, and there's the purest kiss in the world between the two of them. And so we see this willingness to kind of play at the edges and give us some ambiguity and give us some shades of gray, and to joke and to be a little sarcastic and to be a little snarky and to be a little satirical, right? The satire, stories that are realistic, stories that are satirical. These are the kinds of stories that thrive in the world today. And yet we long. There's something in us that longs for the fairy tale. They longs for something pure, for something true. But it's like almost as if to be successful in doing that today in the world around us, where we've sort of had our eyes opened, right? There is a certain aspect in which you could say that, you could say that in a sense, like the virginity of the world has been lost. There is the sense in which we have lost our ability to to be innocent, right? We can't do it anymore. We can't get that back. And so now that sort of the veil has been removed from our eyes, the question is, how do we tell a story? But we still long, because we still long for a story where good triumphs over evil and true love conquers all and all those kinds of things. But how do we do it? How do we tell a story like that in a world where we struggle to believe that that's actually true? And I think The Princess Bride is a beautiful example of how you can actually still do that. You can play with it. You can subvert. You can twist things. But at the end of the day, we need to come back to the fact that good and evil actually are things that we can land on, that there needs to be a unity at the end. It can't just disperse out from there. And I just want to take just a couple of minutes here just to talk about, as we're getting to a close here, as to why does this matter? Like, why does the story actually need to have that kind of unity at the end? Why is it that there needs to be certain kinds of stories that give us black and white, that give us good and evil and, love and hate and all these kinds of things. Why is it that we need to have those? And it's because we need stories. We need stories that teach us about shades of gray, because that's the world that we live in. But we also need stories that teach us, that give us images, with which to people our imagination, right? We have an imagination. We have a landscape. We have a world in our mind, and we need images. We need archetypes. This is why they're so powerful, that live in our mind, that give us a way of saying, oh, that's what that is, right? Because if you think about, let's say you think about evil, there is no image. Like if you try to imagine what evil is, and you try to put an image to it, or you try to put a description to it, it's like, how do you do it? The only way you can do it is by comparing it to other things that we know, right? Like you could say, well, it's kind of like this, or it's kind of like that. It's kind of like I don't know, like a savage, thing, but it's dark, right? You could say it's dark, or it's twisted, or it's corrupt, but you can only do it by comparing it to other things and to other things and to other things. It's the same thing with good, right? What is good? Well, it's kind of like, you tell a story about something that you saw, something did, right? It's the love of a parent for the child, and the child doesn't deserve it, but they love him anyway, or compassion, or, like you grab at things. But the thing is that all of these are just stories that we're telling ourselves, right? About what goodness is. And if you try to boil it all the way down, you would, but what is evil? Like, what is it? Like, if I could hold it in my hand, what is it? Or what is good? You'd get something really, really abstract. You'd get something like darkness and light, right? Like that's what you get. You get something like darkness and light. And yet we know that even falls short, because darkness isn't evil in itself. It's just the absence of light. So even that falls short. So what do we do? The answer is that we don't encounter pure evil or pure goodness in the world around us. But we need to have symbols. We need to have stories that give us archetypes that we can grab onto, that we can use in our imagination, because we can't imagine abstraction. Like we just can't, like our mind recoils from it. We can't imagine, oh, pure evil. Like I don't know what that is, but I can imagine the story, right? And I can know the story with the evil stepmother, and I can know the story with a witch. And when I hear somebody tempting me with a voice that is seductive, I remember there's a story in my mind deep down in there that maybe I heard when I was a really little kid. And I remember that story about that thing that the witch was offering with the poisoned apple. And there's something in me, because I had that story deep down inside that's been told to me over and over again. There's something in me that hears the voice of temptation, that hears the voice of seduction, and says, no. Don't take the apple. Don't do it. It's a trick. It's a mistake. Or there's something deep down inside that when I'm confronted by something terrible in my life and something monstrous in my life, that I know that cowardice rises up in me, and I want to run away, and I want to hide, and I want to crawl under my bed and cry myself to sleep or something like that. But then I remember the story, right? And I remember the story of the knight on the horse facing the dragon and the fire and the smoke, and there's this essence, there's something in me that wants to be that, right? There's something in me that recognizes that that's what a hero is, that's what a hero does. And I need to be able to do that too. I need to rise and face the monster. And these are very deep images. These are things that are happening, I believe, for us at a very subconscious level. The way that stories influences us is very, very deep. And sometimes these are stories that we tell to children. And this is what's so important. This is why fairy tales are typically thought of as children's stories. It's not because they are, kind of more, they're not applicable for adults. It's not that, right? Fairy stories, and C.S. Lewis talks about this, about how you will eventually get to an age where you can begin to appreciate fairy tales again in your older age. So it's not just that they're real simple, they're stories for simpletons or something like this. Rather, it's that they're fundamental. These are stories that are fundamental, that they are basic, and that they are stories upon which we kind of build our lives. And so And so children need these stories more than anything else. Children need to know at the end of the day that good and evil are things. Like that they are things, that heroism is a thing, that corruption is a thing, that there are monsters and that there are heroes, and that there are things that we need to seek, and that there are things that are beautiful and there are things that are ugly, and all those kinds of things. Like we need to people our imagination with those kinds of symbols so that when the child grows up and begins to encounter the world in all of its ambiguity and all of its shades of gray and all of its uncertainty, that we can still identify what those things are, what the deep archetypal things are at the bottom. Because if we don't have that, like when we're making decisions in our lives, like there's all kinds of confusion, there's all kinds of uncertainty. And if I don't have something sewn into me at a very, very deep level, that when I'm confronted with these things and I have to make a decision in my life, and maybe it's an important decision, maybe it's a split-second decision, maybe it's like I need to be able to turn to something that is in me deep down inside, and that's what fairy tales give us. Fairy tales give us the strength. They give us the things that are at the bottom of our nature, right? It gives us princesses and princes, and it gives us witches and dragons, and it gives us those kinds of things, ways of talking about like the fundamental qualities of the world in ways that we understand at a visceral and a primal level, and that get incorporated into who we are. And if we don't give children that, if we insist on saying, no, we need to teach children shades of gray, and listen to me, it's important to teach people shades of gray. It is, absolutely. But it needs to come later. It needs to come when kids get to an age, and kids will, this is the thing about it, kids will show you when they're ready for things, right? Because if you expose a child to something that they're not ready for, they'll be afraid, or they'll laugh at it, or they'll get uncomfortable, or they'll squirm, or they'll get bored, or they'll fall asleep. But if you give it to them at the age where they're ready for it, you'll see them get captivated by it because it calls to them, because it's what they're learning about. And so as kids grow to become teenagers, then they begin to learn, oh, mom and dad aren't just purely good, right? Like they have problems, right? They have issues, or if it's mom or dad, or whatever heroic people that there are in their life, or these kinds of people that they've looked to as the authority or whatever. It's like, oh, actually, there's a time and place to question authority. There's a time and place to actually be like, oh, wow, you know what? Maybe that's not true. And that's where that needs to come in. And that's when we need to give those kinds of stories to ourselves and to our children. But when they're small, when they're young, we need to, at the core of our being, and we need this also as adults too, and if we didn't get this as children, we need to teach it to ourselves, that there are themes, that there are deep, rich, fundamental principles at the core of our experience that we need to be able to draw upon, that are going to give us the resources to be able to face the monsters in our lives. And I'll just close with these couple of quotes for you from G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, two of my favorite writers. And so G.K. Chesterton says this: "The baby has known the dragon intimately ever since he had an imagination. What the fairy tale provides for him is a St. George to kill the dragon. Exactly what the fairy tale does is this: it accustoms him for a series of clear pictures to the idea that these limitless terrors have a limit, that these shapeless enemies have enemies in, as he puts it, the nights of God, that there is something in the universe more mystical than darkness and stronger than strong fear." C.S. Lewis puts it this way: "Since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you are making their destiny not brighter, but darker." I think that's a great way to kind of close with this. And so I would just want to encourage you, as we are wrapping up here, is don't give up on fairy tales, right? Fairy tales in some ways are some of the purest and most powerful and most fundamental kinds of stories. And we just need to find ways of telling fairy tales and these kinds of fundamental stories in the modern world that allows for some of that ambiguity and allows for some of that play at the edges, but doesn't lose the essence that's at the core. And I think that The Princess Bride is a remarkable example of this. I would invite you and encourage you, go watch The Princess Bride, watch it with your kids if they're of age, to be able to appreciate it. And also I'd encourage you to go back to The Wizard of Oz as well. The Wizard of Oz, the old 1939 film, is wonderful, and the stories by L. Frank Baum, they're classic. And so we can do this. We can still tell these kinds of stories to each other and even to ourselves. And if we were those that maybe didn't necessarily get that when we were young, hey, listen, there's still, you're never too old for fairy tales. And so you just get to a point where you get old enough to begin to appreciate them again. And so I want to encourage you, go read a fairy tale, go watch one of these movies, and please enjoy that. And I look forward to seeing you again in the next episode.